For centuries, the Catholic Church was seen as the unshakable rock of Christendom, the direct link between the divine and the human. However, at certain moments in history, this solid structure was shaken by disputes so intense that the very throne of St. Peter was contested, not by heretics or external enemies, but by figures who emerged from within the Church itself, claiming for themselves the role of God's representative on earth. Who were these men who dared to challenge the most sacred authority of Christendom? How did they reach the point of dividing the faith of millions and turning the Church into a battlefield of spiritual and political struggles? The Catholic Church was always the center of life in the Middle Ages, an entity that transcended kingdoms and influenced the spiritual, political, and cultural life of Europe. Its strength seemed unshakable, but, like every human institution, it was subject to internal tensions. Over the centuries, these tensions turned into schisms that challenged not only the Church's authority but also the faith of millions. The power of the papacy was absolute, a visible symbol of the connection between heaven and earth. But this position of supremacy also made the throne of St. Peter a coveted target. In periods of great instability, figures emerged who presented themselves as legitimate leaders, promising to restore the true faith or correct the Church's course. These disputes culminated in moments of crisis that divided Christendom in an almost irreparable way. One of these critical periods was the Western Schism, between the 14th and 15th centuries. For nearly 4 decades, the Church was divided, with 2, and at one point 3, men claiming to be the true pope. This division was not merely a matter of power. It fragmented kingdoms, set kings against kings, and turned the faith of millions into an ideological battlefield. What would it have been like to choose between 2 representatives of God? That was the reality people faced. The dispute began with the death of Pope Gregory XI, who had returned the papal seat from Avignon to Rome in an attempt to restore the central authority of the Church. But his death created a power vacuum. Urban VI was elected in Rome, but his authoritarian behavior quickly alienated many cardinals, who, in response, elected a second pope, Clement VII, who established his court in Avignon. It was the beginning of a division that would not only mark the history of the Church but also question its very spiritual legitimacy. Imagine the chaos this generated. The Pope, the ultimate symbol of Christian unity, was now a divided figure. Kings and rulers across Europe had to choose sides, not just out of spiritual loyalty but also for political calculation. The Church, which should have been the cornerstone of stability, became a point of tension. What did this mean for ordinary believers? How could a simple peasant decide which pope to follow when even theologians and clergy were divided? These crises were more than political conflicts. For many, they represented a spiritual battle. Some believed the division was a divine punishment, a reflection of the accumulated sins within the Church itself. Others saw these schisms as the work of demonic forces, using human ambition to erode the foundations of faith. Did these dissident figures emerge solely out of vanity, or were they instruments of something greater and even more incomprehensible? The fragmentation of the papacy also gave rise to a singular phenomenon, the Antipopes. These men, who proclaimed themselves the legitimate leaders of Christendom, were seen by their followers as restorers of the true faith but by their opponents as dangerous usurpers. Their existence was an affront to the idea of spiritual unity and a reminder that even the most sacred institutions are not immune to corruption and ambition. But who exactly were these Antipopes? Many of them did not appear out of nowhere but were deeply rooted in the Church's structure. Some were cardinals with the support of powerful kings. Others were charismatic figures who inspired devotion among their followers. What motivated them? Pure political ambition, or a genuine belief that they were fulfilling a divine purpose? To understand their rise, it is essential to look beyond the surface. The schism was not just a religious crisis. It reflected the social and political tensions of medieval Europe. Feudalism was in decline, and royal power was beginning to centralize. At the same time, the Church faced internal criticism over corruption, excessive wealth, and a disconnect from the people's spiritual needs. The emergence of the Antipopes was, in part, a consequence of these pressures. By challenging papal authority, the Antipopes forced the Church to confront its own contradictions. They exposed how deeply the ecclesiastical structure was intertwined with secular politics and demonstrated that, in moments of crisis, even faith could be wielded as a weapon. However, their stories also raise intriguing questions. To what extent were their actions the result of human choices, and how much was influenced by spiritual forces operating behind the scenes? The schism officially ended in 1417 with the Council of Constance, which elected Martin V as the sole pope and reunified the church. But the legacy of the Antipopes remained. They not only divided the church, they transformed it. Their actions forced reforms, brought hidden tensions to light, and left lessons that still echo today. When we look at this history, we are inevitably led to a question. Were the Antipopes mere usurpers or symbols of something deeper, a continuous struggle between light and shadow within the faith itself? At the heart of the disputes that shook Christendom stand figures who left profound marks on the history and faith of millions. The Antipopes, as they came to be known, were men who divided the throne of St. Peter but also embodied the spiritual and political conflicts that eroded the church. Each of them was, at once, a hero to their followers and a traitor to their enemies. Hippolytus of Rome, the first to formally challenge a pope, was no ordinary leader. In the 3rd century, when he opposed Calixtus I, Hippolytus was driven by a fervent belief that he was defending the purity of the faith. To him, Calixtus had compromised Christ's teachings by forgiving repentant sinners. But Hippolytus was more than a zealous theologian. He was a man whose convictions led him to establish a separate community, drawing followers who shared his vision of an uncompromising and pure church. Centuries later, during the Western Schism, figures like Clement VII and John XI would elevate these disputes to unprecedented levels. Clement VII was known for his diplomatic skill and the strength of his court in Avignon. He built a network of alliances that made him as powerful as the official pope in Rome. To his supporters, Clement was the legitimate leader, a restorer of true spiritual authority. To his opponents, he was a symbol of division and a traitor to Christian unity. Meanwhile, John XI took on a different role. Charismatic, shrewd, and highly political, John led with skill and knew how to use the resources at his disposal to consolidate his position. He negotiated with kings and emperors, promising favors and influence in exchange for support. Yet his downfall at the Council of Constance revealed that even the most skilled strategists could become victims of their own ambition. Despite their differences, these men shared one thing: the belief that they were acting for a greater purpose. No matter how history has judged them, each carried with him the conviction that his leadership was legitimate, a reflection of divine will. Their narratives were carefully constructed, using prophecies, symbols, and even celestial events to justify their position. Clement VII, for instance, claimed that a conjunction of stars during his coronation confirmed his divine authority. These leaders also faced the risks of their position. Being a rival to the throne of St. Peter was not only politically dangerous but spiritually perilous. Many of them met tragic ends. Hippolytus died reconciled with the church but left behind a divided community. John XI was deposed, imprisoned, and ultimately died far from the power he had sought so fiercely. Clement VII saw his court collapse under the weight of the reforms that unified Christendom. But the Antipopes were not alone. They were supported by kings, clerics, and entire communities who believed in their cause. These alliances revealed how deeply the church was intertwined with the politics of the time. For kings and nobles, supporting an alternative leader was a way to consolidate power in their own territories. For local communities, these men represented hope for change in uncertain times. However, not everyone saw these leaders as saviors. Many regarded them as traitors, men who used faith to advance personal ambitions. The division between their supporters and detractors was so deep that it echoed at all levels of society, from the most refined courts to the humblest peasants. The Antipopes were not simplistic figures. They were protagonists of an era when faith and power intertwined in complex and often contradictory ways. They represented the struggle between continuity and reform, between unity and fragmentation. Above all, they personified the internal tensions of a church that, while presenting itself as the pillar of divine truth, was composed of men and their imperfections. In the end, the history of these leaders leads us to a question that transcends time. To what extent were their actions driven by a spiritual calling, and how much were the result of human ambition? Were they agents of chaos, or necessary instruments to expose the contradictions of an institution that often seemed to forget its own essence? In an era of widespread illiteracy, where words reached few, symbols were the universal language of faith and power. For the Antipopes, crafting an iconic image was not just a matter of style but a strategy for survival. Every coat of arms, seal, or emblem carried a clear message: who they were, what they represented, and why they deserved the throne of St. Peter. Clement VII, based in Avignon, chose a coat of arms adorned with a crescent moon and stars. Officially, the emblem alluded to his family lineage, but many saw in it a mystical significance. The moon and stars evoked cosmic harmony, suggesting that his leadership was guided by the heavens. To his followers, the coat of arms reflected his divine connection. To his detractors, it was a calculated attempt to manipulate popular beliefs. John XXIII, on the other hand, adopted an even more provocative symbol, a serpent entwined in branches. The serpent, traditionally associated with wisdom and renewal, also carried dangerous associations tied to temptation and sin. His choice sparked equal parts curiosity and criticism. Some saw it as a sign of cunning and strength, others as evidence of dark intentions. But symbols were not limited to coats of arms. The Antipopes also used art and architecture to communicate their authority. Clement VII, for example, had the Avignon Cathedral decorated with stars and crescents similar to his emblem, reinforcing his identity in every religious celebration. His processions were meticulously planned, with attire and accessories that created an aura of sanctity. John XXIII, by contrast, was known for his preference for golden details in his vestments, projecting an image of enlightened leadership. These choices were not merely aesthetic. In the medieval imagination, a coat of arms or an altar adorned with celestial symbols carried spiritual weight. To the faithful, these images were visible manifestations of a leader's divine mission. But they were also weapons in the hands of their adversaries. Clement VII, with his crescent moon, was described in pamphlets as a falling star, brilliant but destined to fall. John XXIII, with his serpent, was compared to the devil himself, an accusation his enemies used to discredit him. The impact of these symbols extended to ceremonies. One chronicler described Clement VII's coronation as a cosmic dance, with stars embroidered on cloaks and golden lamps illuminating the altar. These visual representations reinforced his narrative that he was a leader chosen by the heavens. John XXIII, in contrast, favored a more grounded but equally imposing tone. His coronations emphasized his political strength, with banners mixing religious symbols and references to secular authority. These symbols also shaped how the Antipopes were remembered. In towns and cities, their coats of arms and seals were reproduced on documents, sculptures, and even coins, creating a visual memory that transcended time. Some of these artifacts still exist, preserved in museums and archives, serving as witnesses to a time when imagery was as powerful as words. However, the power of symbols also made them dangerous. Relics associated with the Antipopes were often destroyed by their successors in an effort to erase their memory. John XXII's coat of arms was removed from numerous chapels after his deposition, while images of Clement VII were burned in public squares. Behind every emblem was an attempt to shape collective perception. The Antipopes knew that the faith of the people was not merely a spiritual matter. It was visual, emotional, and deeply symbolic. To win hearts and minds, it was necessary to build an identity that transcended words and rooted itself in the imagination. In the end, these symbols raise an intriguing question. Were they mere tools of propaganda, or did they reflect the true essence of these leaders? The coats of arms, vestments, and altars are witnesses to a time when the sacred and the profane were so intertwined that it became impossible to distinguish them. And you? Have you ever wondered how the symbols we see today shape the way we perceive the world around us? In the Middle Ages, the sky was seen as a mirror of the divine. Every comet, eclipse, or unusual light was interpreted as a message from God or a warning from the forces of evil. During the Great Western Schism, the sky seemed to respond to the chaos on Earth, with phenomena that fueled disputes and shaped popular imagination. One of the most discussed events was the coronation of Clement VII in Avignon. On the same night, reports of a stellar conjunction began to circulate. Preachers declared that the heavens had aligned in support of the antipope, reinforcing his authority among the faithful. But in Rome, the phenomenon was described as an omen, a warning that his leadership would bring disorder to Christendom. And it wasn't the first time the cosmos seemed to speak. During the rise of John XXIII, a partial eclipse occurred over Italy. His allies interpreted it as the beginning of a new era, while his detractors pointed to the temporary darkness as a sign of impending disaster. These cosmic events sparked divided interpretations, but they were never overlooked. In addition to the sky, The supernatural seemed to invade the lands of the Antipopes. In Avignon, during a procession in honor of Clement VII, witnesses claimed to have seen bright lights dancing above the cathedral. While his followers believed they were angels, opponents said they were demons, drawn by the ambition of the alternative leader. But the phenomena were not confined to grand events. In southern France, peasants reported hearing heavenly chants coming from the forests during one of Clement's sermons. Meanwhile, in Rome, a report of sudden storms during meetings of cardinals was considered a direct response from the heavens to the decisions that would shape the future of the Church. These celestial signs were not just metaphors. For a deeply religious society, the skies were the stage where God expressed His will. At every unusual light or unexpected thunder, entire communities gathered to discuss what it could mean. The faith of the people, already shaken by internal divisions, found in these phenomena a way to seek direction. Leaders like Clement VII and John XI understood the power of these events and used them as tools of legitimacy. Sermons were adapted to connect eclipses or comets to biblical passages about renewal or judgment. These narratives strengthened their positions and made each natural phenomenon a weapon in their spiritual battles. However, the signs also carried a dangerous weight. When a comet crossed the sky during the death of a bishop loyal to John XXII, it was quickly interpreted as a sign of divine wrath. Clement VII's followers used the event to attack their rivals, spreading rumors that the heavens were punishing those who supported the Roman antipope. These supernatural narratives were not limited to the high clergy. In isolated villages, stories of lights in the skies were told around campfires, mixing facts and beliefs. Some of these stories gained strength over time, being recorded in local chronicles that reinforced the perception that the conflict between popes and antipopes was more than human, it was cosmic. The connection between the sky and religious disputes fueled a constant tension between fear and faith. When an eclipse darkened the sun, people didn't see an astronomical event, they saw a warning. When shooting stars crossed the horizon, they weren't just cosmic dust, they were messengers of destinies no one fully understood. Still, some doubts remained. If the heavens truly responded to human actions, why were their messages so ambiguous? Were the natural phenomena merely reflecting the imagination of a divided society, or was something greater operating behind the scenes? For the Antipopes, the celestial signs represented both a blessing and a burden. While some events strengthened them, others questioned their legitimacy. However, the struggle to interpret the heavens showed that, in times of crisis, even the firmament could become an arena of dispute. And have you ever wondered if the phenomena we see today, eclipses, shooting stars, sudden storms, are just coincidences or messages we have yet to decipher? In the Middle Ages, faith was sustained by objects and practices that transcended the material world. Sacred relics, elaborate rituals, and beliefs in curses connected the earthly to the divine and shaped perceptions of power. During the disputes between popes and antipopes, these elements became crucial tools in the battle for legitimacy, but they also carried mysteries that many preferred not to question. Among the most famous relics was a fragment of the true cross, the wood from Christ's crucifixion, supposedly kept by Benedict XIII in Avignon. This antipope used the relic in grand ceremonies, attracting crowds of faithful who saw it as proof of his connection to the sacred. But for his opponents, it was impossible to believe that a contested figure could possess something so precious. In sermons preached in Rome, Benedict's possession of the true cross was described as sacrilege, an attempt to manipulate the divine for political ends. Another notable example was the cloak of St. Peter, which Clement VII claimed to have received in a vision. According to him, the apostle himself had given him the piece as a symbol of celestial approval. Although the story gained strength among his followers, there were no historical records of the existence of this relic before his declaration. For his critics, the cloak was a symbol of Clement's unbridled ambition, while his supporters saw it as a sign that God was guiding his leadership. But it wasn't just tangible objects that built the power of the Antipopes. Rituals and ceremonies became moments of spiritual and political reinforcement. Benedict XIII, for example, was accused of performing masses that included celestial invocations, during which bright lights were seen on the altar. His followers believed they were angelic manifestations, while opponents said they were elaborate tricks to impress the people. John XXII, known for his skill in combining politics and faith, incorporated symbols and relics into his coronations. In one of them, it is said that a sudden rain during the procession was interpreted by his allies as a divine blessing. For his enemies, however, it was a sign that his leadership was cursed. The belief in curses was also part of the narratives. When Clement VII faced a series of disasters in his territories, from plagues to devastating storms, his detractors declared that he was under God's wrath. These tragedies were seen as punishments for challenging the unity of the Church. On the other hand, his followers interpreted the same events as tests of faith, comparing Clement to biblical figures who suffered to fulfill God's will. The followers of the Antipopes were also not exempt from accusations of involvement with the supernatural. Stories of inexplicable tragedies, such as sudden deaths and financial losses, were attributed to loyalty to contested leaders. In sermons, bishops loyal to the official pope warned that those who followed an antipope would bring eternal damnation upon themselves. Despite the narratives of curses, many contested leaders used mysticism to their advantage. Clement VII, in particular, promoted the idea that the tragedies he faced were parallels to Christ's sufferings, reinforcing his image as a legitimate leader destined to face challenges to purify the Church. This narrative resonated with the most fervent faithful, who saw him as a martyr of faith. The rituals associated with these figures were also moments of spiritual tension. During a mass in Avignon, a thunderous crash knocked a crucifix off the altar, frightening those present. For some, it was a sign of divine approval. For others, a warning of the danger of following an alternative leader. These events, whether coincidences or not, shaped public perception and reinforced either fear or faith. However, the use of relics and rituals also raised doubts. Were these practices genuine manifestations of the divine, or a sophisticated form of psychological control? What about the curses that seemed to haunt the Antipopes? Were they real punishments or just narrative constructs to weaken their position? Regardless of the answers, it is undeniable that these elements deeply marked the dispute for the leadership of the Church. The relics, with their aura of sacred power, attracted crowds and solidified alliances. The rituals, with their theatricality, kept the flame of devotion alive. And the curses, with their burden of mystery, reminded everyone that even spiritual power had a price. In the end, the stories of relics, rituals, and curses from the Antipopes leave us with an intriguing question. Were these practices a reflection of faith or the need for control in times of crisis? And you, have you ever reflected on how objects and rituals shape not only history but also the way we perceive the sacred? The history of the Antipopes leads us down a path where power, faith, and ambition intertwine in a game of light and shadow. These alternative leaders not only challenged the sacred structure of the Catholic Church but also exposed the internal tensions of an institution that sought balance between the divine and the human. From relics to rituals, from celestial signs to political disputes, the Antipopes shaped not only the destiny of medieval Christendom but also the way we understand spiritual power. Were they villains or visionaries? Agents of chaos or pieces of a larger plan that still eludes us? Now, I want to know your opinion. What theme would you like to see explored in future videos? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and together we will continue to unravel the most fascinating mysteries of history and spirituality. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I have specially selected for you some videos filled with deep knowledge and fascinating discoveries that you're going to love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step to transform your reality.